Robinson was openly antagonistic. To most questions, he either pleaded ignorance or said he would find the answer and send it on later. At one point, Rather asked about the company's leasing subsidiary, whose existence he had learned of only through an unsolicited letter to Kravis offering to buy it. "What leasing company?" Robinson said. And so it went. After a series of particularly evasive answers, one of Rather's aides, Scott Stewart, threw up his hands. "Do we want to continue this charade?" he asked Rather, "or can we go home now?" Robinson was issued out. The last to be questioned, Dean Posvar, the planning chief, was little better. It was like interrogating prisoners of war, Rather thought, and he half expected Posvar to give his name, rank, and serial number. When the last session ended, Rather stormed out. "This is useless," he muttered to Josh Gottbaum, a Lazard Frere banker monitoring the interviews. "These guys aren't saying anything." After making farewell phone calls to Cohen and Goodfriend Monday morning, Forsman told himself he wasn't sorry things hadn't worked out. Dealing with Shearson had been as frustrating as any experience of his career. Working with junk bonds made him want to wash his hands. His only regret was that without a serious challenger, Kravis would probably waltz off with the largest prize in history. Shearson couldn't stop him. The two sides would probably end up as a team, Forsman figured. Good riddance. They deserved each other. Then Jeff Boise called. Boise wasn't about to give up on RJR Nabisco. He had 3 of Goldman's best clients chomping at the bit to get a piece of this deal. Procter & Gamble badly wanted RJR's biscuits business. Ralston Purina of St. Louis coveted a host of food brands, and David Murdoch, the chief of Castle & Cook, parent of Dole Fruits, was dying to get his hands on Dole's arch-rival, Del Monte. As seriously as his clients sought pieces of Johnson's company, no one wanted this deal more than Boise. Much like Shearson, Goldman Sachs was about to unveil a multi-billion-dollar investment fund. The Goldman Fund, though, was to be earmarked for bridge loans. For the first time, it would allow staid old Goldman to compete head-to-head with moneyed megafirms such as Shearson and Merrill Lynch. The fund was Boise's baby. An RJR Nabisco bid would be its debut. The consortium Boise envisioned would be a dream team. All he needed to complete it was someone interested in buying the tobacco operations. That someone was going to be Ted Forstmann. Forstmann just had to be convinced, and Boise knew all the right buttons to push. All that day, he hammered at Forstmann, reminding him of the reasons they had attempted this deal in the first place. Kravis had to be stopped, Boise insisted, before he jeopardized every Fortune 500 company. If KKR wins this, there'll be no stopping them, he argued. They'll be bigger than Boone Pickens, Carl Icahn, and all the Raiders wrapped into one. Corporate America would stand up and cheer a challenger to the junk bond cartel, Boise told Forstmann. Whoever beat Kravis would emerge the true hero of this mud wrestling match. That hero, Boise suggested, had to be Ted Forstmann. Only Forstmann had the right combination of skill and power to pull it off. "You don't realize how strong you are," Boise said. Forstmann Little's cheap money gave it an edge over all other competitors. "You just don't realize how powerful your money is. It's the key to the whole deal." Soon, Forstmann began to nibble at Boise's bait. The lure of striking a blow against Kravis and the junk bond junkies was too strong. And no one could deny the appeal of working with blue-chip companies such as P&G. Forstmann allowed himself to think out loud. "If we do our due diligence, and this really is economically viable, these guys you've rounded up are going to be aggressive participants," he mused. "Everybody is a real money player. Nobody comes from the other world. No one's part of the cartel. Boy, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing?" "Yes," Boise said, "and it wouldn't have to be risky." "I know you're not going to do anything risky. I know your parameters. But think of this. If this deal could meet your standards, think of what we could accomplish. These junk bond guys have had their way for 3-4 years. We could turn the tide. Forsman found himself thinking of the Revlon deal. The junk bond cartel had risen to power on Ron Perlman's takeover of Revlon. He again felt a pang of responsibility for that loss and the damage the raiders had wrought. He had been defeated in that fight. But now, an image began to form in Forsman's mind. The junk bond hordes are at the city gates, Forsman thought. We could stop them, once and for all. This is where we could stand at the bridge and push the barbarians back. Wouldn't that be phenomenal? He would do it. Screw Cohen. We don't need him, Forsman said. Cohen is so inexperienced, he's bound to fail. This would be Forsman versus Kravis. The good guys, P&G, Ralston, and Castle and Cook, versus the junk bond hordes of Drexel Burnham and Merrill Lynch. You know the conditions, Forsman told Boise. No junk paper, none of that crazy shit, and we have to be invited to bid. Okay, Boise said. He would have pledged his left leg and his bonus at that point. And, Forsman added, Forsman Little must have a veto over the bidding group's moves. Boise agreed to that, too. Slowly, Johnson's group moved toward assembling a bit of its own. Johnson, who had spent the weekend in Atlanta, returned to New York Monday afternoon and met for an hour with representatives of Texas investor Robert Bass, one of several parties Cohen was considering bringing into the fold. Afterward, Johnson, Horrigan, and the other RJR Nabisco executives met for dinner with the Shearson and Solomon teams in one of Shearson's paisley wallpapered dining rooms. Two schools of thought were forming as to the best way to approach the bid. The Solomon team, led by Goodfriend and Strauss, was leaning toward an immediate bid, something that would show the world and the board they were for real. Something around $92 a share, just enough to top Kravis's $90. It was a trader's instinct. Bid fast, top the other guy by a fraction of a point, and wait to see what happened next. Another faction, led by Steve Goldstone and Tom Hill, judged that approach short-sighted. Topping Kravis now, they argued, would only lead to a drawn-out bidding war that would send prices spiraling upward. An auction was the last thing they wanted. Somehow they had to bring a swift end to the process, a single, sharp, decisive blow that would knock out Kravis and secure the board once and for all. A bid of $100 a share wasn't out of the realm of possibility to Hill and Goldstone. By evening's end, Goldstone felt the group was leaning toward his position. Tuesday morning, Goldstone took a call from Peter Atkins, the attorney working with Hugel's committee. It had been a week since Kravis's bid, and with his due diligence underway, Atkins was curious as to when he could expect a bid from Johnson. Goldstone decided to try an idea out on him. If we gave you a massive bid, a preemptive bid, Goldstone said, would the board consider entering into a merger agreement? It would allow the board to lock in a high price, Goldstone suggested, while in effect setting a bidding floor. Atkins didn't seem to give the proposal much thought. His message was clear. Just make your bid, Steve. Make your bid. Afterward, Goldstone chewed over the idea further. A blockbuster bid in return for a merger agreement. He liked it. Johnson, too, thought it sounded like a sensible approach. But how to get Atkins to take the bait? Goldstone got an idea from Johnson. From conversations with Hugel, Johnson knew the board was deathly afraid the management group would cut a deal with Kravis, eliminating the competition and, Hugel feared, leading inevitably to a lower bid. Maybe, Goldstone reasoned, the board would leap at the chance to seize a high bid as a way of spoiling any chance of further talks between the two sides. Goldstone talked to Atkins again Wednesday morning. Here's what I have in mind, Goldstone told the lawyer. We would like to negotiate a merger agreement with you. It'll establish a floor. I can tell you, if you're willing to proceed on that basis, we will give you a very, very good bid. A preemptive bid. Look, Atkins said, why don't you just give me the bid now? The board is very interested in receiving your bid. Atkins thought, hadn't he heard this before? But Peter, it's not that simple, Goldstone countered. Why should we give you a bid if there's no quid pro quo? We're not getting anything back. Right now, we have the opportunity to negotiate with our competition. If we do, and we're successful, you'll see a bid much lower than this. I'm not going to throw a bid out to you now until we're through talking with our competition." It was a bluff. Goldstone had no idea whether Johnson's group could work something out with Kravis. As heated as the public rhetoric had become, the chances seemed low. But Atkins didn't know that. Goldstone had to use his own fear against him. "Oh, I see the leverage," Atkins said. "You're really giving us an incentive." Goldstone almost heard the light bulb click on over the lawyer's head. "That's right." "I see," Atkins said. "Now you've given us something to think about. Well, I'll discuss it with the appropriate people and get back to you. Do you have a proposed merger agreement in mind?" "Yes, I do." "Why don't you send it up to me?" Goldstone was excited. He instructed Gar Basin to send over an agreement that afternoon, and late he rushed over to lunch at Shearson. The Solomon chieftains, Gutfriend and Strauss, were already waiting in Cohen's office when Goldstone arrived. They repaired to Cohen's dining room for lunch, where Goldstone briefed the group on his conversation with Atkins. Gutfriend was immediately skeptical. A preemptive bid? Goldstone's strategy, he said, would push the group into a bid well above $90 a share. Why go so high? "Aren't we wasting our money?" Gutfriend asked. "Why should we do this? Can you tell me we'll actually get a merger agreement if we do this? What are the chances it'll work?" "I'd say less than 50-50, Goldstone admitted. Goldstone was baffled. Hadn't these people told him just 2 nights ago they were in favor of a preemptive bid? The lawyer tried to read Cohen, but couldn't. He thought Jack Nussbaum shared Gutfriend's concerns about overpaying. After lunch, Goldstone returned to his office, worried. He didn't call Atkins back. For the first time, he realized he was making promises his group, especially Gutfriend, had no intention of keeping. He was irritated. Gutfriend didn't seem to understand even the most fundamental bidding strategy. Now, Goldstone knew, he had to move very carefully. He may already have gone too far. On Tuesday evening, the due diligence sessions completed, Kravis returned from the plaza to his office in a black mood, ready to discuss with Roberts the plan for their next move. Their bid was at a crossroads. After seizing the initiative from Johnson's group a week before, they were losing momentum. Nothing seemed to be going right. Due diligence had been a disaster. Short of a miracle, Kravis and Roberts were facing the biggest deal of their lives with little more financial guidance than that available to an RJR Nabisco retiree. If that weren't bad enough, Kravis was hearing ominous rumblings among his investors. Friday had seen a spate of newspaper stories suggesting that some of Kohlberg-Kravis's largest backers were uneasy about the aggressive tack Kravis had taken. The involvement of state pension funds in a hostile bid spawned headlines and partisan political squabbles in Oregon, Michigan, and Massachusetts. Kravis and his people tried to calm their investors, but the pressure on them was mounting. He'd even had Eric Gleacher ask Hugel to assure his investors he wasn't a hostile bidder. Kravis suspected Tom Hill and the management group were behind some of the trouble in his rear, and he was right. One of Kravis's most influential backers was Doug LeBon of Los Angeles-based Wilshire Associates, a pension fund advisor that called the shots for a number of Kravis's largest investors, including the states of Massachusetts, Oregon, and Iowa. LeBon's clients accounted for roughly 25% of the money behind Kravis. No sooner had Kravis announced his tender offer than Wilshire's clients came under pressure from all sides to denounce the move. LeBon himself got angry phone calls from RJR Nabisco executives, including Harold Henderson, who heatedly pointed out that Wilshire's agreements with its clients forbade backing hostile deals. Of all his woes, though, none bothered Kravis more than the press. Kohlberg-Kravis was getting killed. Following a week of controversy over Kravis's franchise remarks, Monday had brought the first full burst of major media attention. "The debt binge. Have takeovers gone too far?" blared at the cover of Business Week. Time weighed in with a hand-wringing report, big-time buyouts. Major business leaders seemed to be popping out of every boardroom with pithy denunciations of LBOs and dire predictions of an America drowning in debt. Every story seemed to take a shot or two at Kravis. Newsweek was the worst. Its coverage included a sidebar on Kravis and Rome, the high-voltage life of a New York super couple, that contained such juicy details as Oscar de la Renta's threat to Kravis to make Rome an honest woman. The press attacks deeply wounded Kravis. George Roberts, who led a private life in California, also found the coverage unnerving. Friends sidled up to him at cocktail parties and asked him whether his business was really good for America. Remarkably, in 13 years of public life, it was the first time the two cousins had been pulled into the glare of a major bidding contest. While Kravis had long been a fixture of the society columns, color pictures and articles in Newsweek and Time were another thing altogether. This kind of publicity could ruin their business. It could also bring down the wrath of Washington, a fact never far from Roberts's mind. "You people in New York are crazy," he said. "This is a terrible environment. We're taking a real beating." Kravis had to agree. "I can't wait to get back to San Francisco," Roberts said. "This town is crazy." The due diligence, the worried investors, the press, there had to be a way to end this. Maybe, the pair agreed, it was time to jumpstart talks with Johnson. As they discussed it, Kravis found himself rationalizing the benefits of a joint bid. "We like Jim Robinson," he said. "We like Peter Cohen, I guess. It wouldn't be so bad, when you think about it." His contempt for Johnson aside, Roberts found himself warming to the idea. Shearson doesn't run food companies for a living, he thought. Cohen will lose interest once he has his fees. Give him half the deal now, Roberts suggested, and we'll probably be able to buy back the rest later on. However distasteful he found approaching Johnson on bended knee, Kravis knew it was the right thing to do. Depressed by the prospect, he looked at his list of telephone messages. As usual, there were several calls from Linda Robinson. Jim Robinson's wife seemed to have Johnson's ear. Linda had no obvious axe to grind here. That had to account for something. He picked up the phone. Linda Robinson was glad to hear from Kravis. As far as she was concerned, the whole fight, the name-calling, the finger-pointing, everything, was getting out of control. There was no earthly reason Kravis couldn't do this deal with Shearson and Solomon. There was every reason he should. It was all about egos, Linda Robinson knew. She considered herself finely attuned to the ways of her swaggering Wall Street clients. As so often happened, Peter Cohen and Tommy Strauss and Henry Kravis and the rest had totally lost sight of their real objective, RJR Nabisco. Their disagreements had nothing to do with shareholder values or fiduciary duties. It was all a test of wills among an intensely competitive clique of macho Park Avenue bullies in pinstripes. At this point, she was well aware, Cohen would never give in to Kravis, or vice versa. Kravis certainly wasn't going to cut a deal with Strauss. Each was determined to be king of the sandbox. Someone had to cut through all the bullshit, she told herself. Absent the built-up emotions, the nut ought to be easy to cut. What this takeover fight needed was, well, a woman's touch. "I know we can work something out," she told Kravis. "Don't give up on Ross. We've just got to get you guys in the same room. We've got to get you guys together." "Linda, I don't know," Kravis said. "We're just nowhere right now. There's a bid and an ask that are just so far apart." Linda Robinson pressed. "There's just got to be a way to get together. Ross is just a great guy. I know you two would get along great. This is just crazy." Kravis agreed. "All right, maybe it does make sense for us to get together," he said. "I'll try to set something up," Linda Robinson said. Linda Robinson called Johnson Wednesday morning, excited. "I think we should give it one more try. I think something could happen. What do you think?" Johnson liked the idea. He too saw no reason not to join forces with Kravis. No matter what Cohen said, Kravis wasn't a devil. They all had too much to lose not to join forces. And frankly, Johnson was losing confidence in Shearson's ability to put together a viable counterbid. Andy Sage was bird-dogging the banker's progress and thought they were going nowhere. "Sure," Johnson said. "Why not?" Carolyn Rome was having a showing of her spring fashions at the Plaza at 2 o'clock, Linda Robinson pointed out. "I'm probably going to see Henry at the fashion show. What should I say?" "Tell Henry it's got to be done at a high level. We made a mistake the last time when Jim and I weren't in the room. It should be Jim and me, no one else. Try that out on him, and let's give it one last gasp." "Oh, and one other thing," Johnson said. "This has to be totally confidential. No one else must know about the approach. No one," Johnson emphasized, "not even, and maybe especially, Peter Cohen. Cohen and Hill were simply too volatile to be brought into the process at this point. Johnson wouldn't even tell Steve Goldstone." Before giving Linda Robinson the go-ahead, Johnson called her husband at American Express. Quickly, Johnson explained the rationale behind the meeting. Jim Robinson agreed. A few minutes before 2 o'clock, Kravis took the elevator down to 58th Street and walked across to the plaza. Inside the hotel's grand ballroom, Kravis found the crowd gathering. Flashbulbs exploded across the wide room, a sea of flashing teeth and violently teased hair. A sense of anticipation pervaded the air as the crowd awaited the unveiling of Rome's spring collection. All the right people were there. Kravis saw Jerome Zipkin, the professional party-goer, to one side, and society matrons Ann Bass and Blaine Trump sitting together. But Kravis had more than fashion on his mind. He surveyed the room a minute before finding Linda Robinson. In addition to counting her a friend, Jim Robinson's wife also adored Carolyn Rome's clothes. Kravis discreetly guided the tall strawberry blonde into a corner. He looked around, taking pains not to be noticed. "So," he asked, "how's it going?" "I'm working on it," Linda Robinson said. "I think it can work. I just know you and Ross can work together. I've got to set something up with just you, George, Ross, and Jim." "Fine. That sounds constructive." "Now," Robinson chided, "if we do this, I want you to be rational. I'm going to tell our guys to be rational, too." Kravis assured her he would be on his best behavior. "And Henry," Robinson said, "I hope this isn't just going to be bullshit, because if it is, you can do it through some other channel." The show was about to start. Kravis excused himself and took a front-row seat by Oscar de la Renta. Linda Robinson slipped into a chair behind them. As the lively music pulsed, Georgia, Hit the Road Jack, Rome's models bounced down the runway in a group of red, navy, and white short-skirt suits, pantsuits with boxy jackets, and jumpsuits topped with crop jackets or sweeping capes. The strength of Rome's collection, as always, was her nightwear, elegant bias-cut dresses in solids or striped silk, slender wool crepes with chiffon godettes, lean tuxedo dresses, and spare strapless slivers. Only her accessories would turn off the critics: pins that overpowered, women's wear daily fretted the next day, scarves that overwhelmed, and handbags that are best left off the runway. Kravis thought it all grand. Beaming with pride, he chatted and laughed with de la Renta throughout the show. As the models made their last turns, Rome herself came out, took a turn, and waved at her husband. She looked ravishing, tall and thin, as she acknowledged the applause. Kravis waved back. Throngs of photographers hovered around Kravis throughout the show, snapping his picture from every conceivable angle. At one point, Linda Robinson leaned over and whispered in his ear. "When you do a really big deal, Henry," she purred, "just think how many photographers there's going to be then." Leaving behind the airy kisses and popping flashbulbs, Kravis crossed the street and returned to his office. During the fashion show, Roberts had canvassed the other partners to gauge their enthusiasm for renewed talks with Johnson. The feeling was positive. The two cousins established what they wanted from any meeting with Johnson, then called Linda Robinson, who had returned to the 48th floor after slipping backstage to congratulate Rome with a kiss on the cheek. "Look," Kravis began, "there's no point in us getting together at all if we can't deal with some of these issues ahead of time." "Okay," Robinson said. "What are the issues?" Kravis wanted majority control of the equity and the board, but soon consented when Robinson insisted on evenly splitting both. It was the price he would have to pay for peace. But on a third issue, he refused to compromise. Drexel had to run the books on the bond offerings, he said. It was the only way Kravis could guarantee a deal this size could be completed. "Linda, listen," he said. "This is very, very important. You've got to understand this. Drexel is going to play this role. It's just got to happen. If that's going to be a problem, this deal is not going to happen." "You know there's real sensitivities on the Drexel thing from the Solomon side," Robinson said. The two firms were arch-rivals at the top of the fiercely competitive bond trading business. "Look," she told Kravis, "Ross wants to do this deal. He wants to go with whoever's best. It shouldn't be a problem." 3 points, 3 agreements. Both Kravis and Robinson were encouraged by their swift progress. Before hanging up, Kravis tried to haggle a minor point. Linda Robinson thought he was backsliding. "Henry, you know, every time we make a little progress here, you can't just go back on it." "All right," Kravis said. "Enough's enough. Do I have your word on that?" "Yes," Kravis said. "Do I have your word on it? Are your people good with you on each of these issues?" "Yes," Linda Robinson said. "There should be no problem." What was needed now, they agreed, was a summit. Johnson liked what he heard as Linda Robinson related her conversation with Kravis. The conditions seemed reasonable. Hell, he thought, Kravis was caving in on the equity, going up to 50-50 from 10% just a week before. A meeting was set for 6 o'clock. "Henry says it has to be absolutely confidential," she told Johnson. "They're not telling their investment bankers. They're not telling anybody." Johnson nodded. It was the way he wanted it too. He was taking no chances that this would end up like the disastrous Cohen-Kravis sessions. Johnson was coming to admire the way Kravis handled his investment bankers, who were kept ignorant and more or less docile. The less they knew, Johnson figured, the less they could screw up. Sometimes he wished he could handle Cohen and Goodfriend the same way. "There was only one hitch," Linda Robinson continued, "a matter of social scheduling. Tonight," she said, "Jim and I have to go to a party at the Gleachers. What do we do?" If Gleacher found out about a summit meeting, they both knew, the news could spread like wildfire. "Don't do anything," Johnson said. "Just call him about 8 o'clock and tell him, that something came up. You can't tell old Gleach. He'd go off like a skyrocket if he knew something was going on." Although she hated to be rude, Robinson agreed it was the only solution. "Now," she said, "you have to call Henry." First, she called Kravis herself. "Now, Ross is going to call you and confirm these things with you. Are we square?" "I'm not going to have any surprises, am I?" Kravis said. "No, you're not." "Good." Minutes later, Johnson placed his call. "Henry," he said, "let's give this thing one more go." It was to be Johnson and Robinson for the management group, Kravis and Roberts for themselves. "All right," Kravis said, "but no one can know. If I hear one word, I'll know it came from your side, because it's not coming from mine." They agreed to meet at the plaza. When Johnson relayed news of the meeting to Jim Robinson, the American Express chief insisted that Cohen be included. It just wouldn't do, he suggested, for Cohen to see his boss and his boss's wife scurrying around his back arranging meetings with his nemesis. Johnson reluctantly agreed. Afterward, Johnson called Cohen. This had to be handled carefully. "I've talked with Henry," Johnson said. "He wants to meet. What do you think I should do?" Go do it, Cohen said. You owe it to yourself and your people. It's the right thing to do. Cohen and Robinson reached 9 West shortly before 6 o'clock. As the trio walked into the plaza, Johnson wanted to make sure Cohen checked his ego at the door. I want this kept on a very low-key basis, Johnson warned the Shearson chief. I don't want any powder kegs going off. Kravis and Roberts were the first to arrive in the 5th-floor suite. It was beautifully redecorated, the pride and joy of the hotel's new owners, Donald and Ivana Trump. The plaza was packed to the gills that night, but Kravis had wangled the suite out of Ivana by promising to be out the next morning by 8, when a photographer was due in to shoot the room for a promotional brochure. As they waited, Kravis paced the room nervously. At one point, he thought he heard noises, a chirping maybe. Kravis walked into the bedroom and found a pair of caged parakeets. He would listen to their chirping throughout the meeting. Johnson, with Cohen and Robinson in tow, arrived at 6. Roberts greeted them with a surprise for Cohen. As an icebreaker, and a play on his earlier comments, he presented the Shearson chairman with a box of fine Monte Cruz cigars. A peace offering, Roberts said as he handed the box to Cohen, but I wish you wouldn't smoke them in here. Cohen smiled. I'm going to sit back here in the corner and smoke them so the smoke doesn't bother you, he said. It was a good start. Listen, Johnson began, addressing the group. Let's see if we can get back to square zero here. This thing is getting ridiculous. It seems to Jim and me, and Peter, that we can work out some compromises that make a lot of sense. It's not going to be everything you would want. It's not going to be everything we would want. But it's going to be good. No one person is going to end up with everything they want to get. In 30 minutes, they had the outlines of an agreement. Control of the RJR Nabisco board would be split 50-50. Neither side would have outright control. The stock would likewise be split down the middle, with Johnson's share coming out of Shearson's take. If Cohen, unaware of Linda Robinson's secret peace initiative, was surprised by the quick consensus, he didn't show it. As for fees, Kravis said he planned to pay each of his 4 investment banks $25 million. In addition, Kohlberg-Kravis intended to take its customary fee of 1%. No one had to do the arithmetic. It amounted to more than $200 million, 3 times the size of any previous merger fee in Wall Street history. Hold on, Robinson interrupted. He remained acutely aware that the eyes of the world were on them. They mustn't appear too greedy, he cautioned. Surprisingly, Kravis agreed, in theory, to reconsider his fee. Kravis brought up Drexel, insisting that the junk bond powerhouse lead the bond offerings necessary to finance the deal. Cohen stiffened. Why Drexel? Look, Peter, Roberts said, if we're putting out $2 billion in equity, well, we wouldn't put that kind of money on the table if the takeout of that bridge wasn't certain. Roberts had no confidence that Solomon, or even Shearson and Solomon combined, could do the job. If we were doing this deal ourselves, without Shearson, we wouldn't even consider you for it. Cohen didn't like the idea of selling bonds under Drexel's yoke, and said so. You know how they are. When Drexel co-manages a deal, they hog the deal. They won't give you anything. This isn't going to be that way, Roberts assured him. You'll get half the fees. If you don't sell a single bond, Peter, you get half the fees, all right? Cohen quit arguing. Other issues came up. Shearson would want to handle the auction of all RJR Nabisco assets to be sold, Cohen said. Tom Hill was projecting $103 million in fees from that alone. That makes no sense, Roberts argued. You ought to parcel out each business to an investment banker seasoned in that industry. Well, at least we'd want to be co-advisor, Cohen said. Why pay twice? No, Cohen said. You don't understand. That's not what's important. What's important is getting your name on the tombstone. The rankings of most active merger advisors were compiled from the names of firms listed on the tombstone advertisements that accompanied all major acquisitions. Cohen wanted to get credit for the sales even if Shearson didn't get a fee. The matter was left unsettled. In an hour, they were finished. The 3 major issues had been agreed to. All that remained was for the lawyers to join them and pound out final details. Johnson was thrilled. The logjam was broken. Thanks in large part to Linda Robinson, he finally had a deal. It wasn't perfect, Johnson told himself, but it sure beat losing, or winning at some level that made it impossible to run his company. As they headed for the door, there were smiles all around. On the way out, Robinson sidled up to Kravis, his wife's horseback riding partner. "You better send a big bouquet of flowers to my wife for this," Robinson said, smiling. "She went way out on a limb for you." So far, only a half-dozen people knew of the secret summit. Downtown, Steve Goldstone was growing suspicious. He couldn't find Johnson or Cohen. No one seemed to be at 9 West. He called Tom Hill at Shearson. "You haven't heard anything, have you?" "No," Hill said. "Have you?" "No, but something is going on." Roberts and Kravis, who remained behind in the suite, were in high spirits. Kravis phoned Dick Beatty, who, with his partner Casey Kogut, met the pair downstairs in the Oak Room for dinner. The lawyers ordered fish, Kravis and Roberts celebratory steaks. Roberts, a finicky eater, found his too peppery and pushed it aside. As they ate, Kravis hurriedly briefed the lawyers on where the talks stood. The group was scheduled to reconvene upstairs in an hour. "It's not the ideal solution," Roberts told the lawyers, "but it's a solution." Returning upstairs, Kravis took a short call from Cohen. "That's funny," Kravis said, putting down the phone. "What?" Beatty asked. "He's bringing Tommy Strauss. You'd think he'd bring Goodfriend." "Strauss?" Beatty was surprised. "Why the hell is he bringing over Tommy Strauss? What the hell does he know about this business?" Kravis didn't have to say how he felt. To Beatty, it was clear he'd just as soon not have to deal with his former friend. Roberts took a second call. An attendant at the Oak Room wanted to know why a Mr. Roberts was charging his dinner to that room. "We show a Mr. Brown registered to that room." Roberts had to smile. Mr. Brown was the code name they had used in registering. "Just put it on the room," he said. Across the street at 9 West, Johnson was growing worried about the size of the group that would return to the plaza. Goldstone had been called and would need to be brought along. So had Goodfriend and Strauss, who clearly expected to go as well. Johnson wanted to keep the meeting small, both for secrecy's sake and because so far large contingents of people seemed to lead invariably to large arguments. Besides, he sensed Kravis didn't much care for either of the Solomon chiefs. Johnson asked Jim Robinson to see to it that only one of them went along. Somehow, Strauss was chosen. Along with Shearson's attorney, Jack Nussbaum, that made 6. Johnson was happy. When Goldstone arrived, Johnson enthusiastically described the afternoon's talks with Kravis. "Everything was going great," Johnson said. "Now we're to the point where Henry is going to want to see the management agreement." Goldstone was immediately suspicious. For 2 weeks, he had jealously guarded the pact's secrecy. Goldstone, like Jim Robinson, was under no illusions about how it would appear if leaked to the press. "You're taking a big risk showing this to Kravis," Goldstone warned. "If these talks fall apart," he said, "Kravis could use it to crucify us in the papers." "Jesus Christ," Johnson said, brushing Goldstone's concerns aside. "They're going to be our partners here. You're going to be partners, you got to have everything on the table. If there are problems, they got to be worked out." Johnson told Goldstone he was being paranoid. At his client's insistence, Goldstone agreed to show Kravis a copy of the agreement. But he didn't like it one bit. The 6 members of Johnson's group hustled back to the plaza around 9 o'clock. After 20 minutes, things were going smoothly, and Johnson, with no appetite for lawyerly details, was growing restless. As best he could tell, it was all over but the fine print. "Is there anything else you need me for?" he asked Goldstone. "No reason for you to hang around that I can see," the lawyer replied. Exhilarated, Johnson returned to 9 West, wolfed down a sandwich, and briefed Sage and Horrigan on the evening's events. Then he walked the 2 blocks to his apartment, showered and shaved, and threw on a sports coat. He prepared to head back to his office, where he planned to do some serious partying. "Why don't you come on over?" Johnson asked his wife, Lori. "You've just got to come. It'll be an interesting experience. You'll have some fun." Peter Darrow, the lead attorney for Solomon Brothers, was unwinding at his Brooklyn Heights home when Solomon's Mike Zimmerman called around 10 o'clock. "Good friends up at 9 West, Zimmerman said, "and he wants you up there right away." Darrow made it to RJR Nabisco's offices in no time. He found the 48th floor deserted except for a seething John Goodfriend. Solomon's chairman was clearly in no mood to party. He was in fact as mad as Darrow had ever seen him. "I don't know what's happening, Peter," Goodfriend said. "There's a meeting over at the plaza. I've been excluded. I don't know why. I want you to get into the meeting right now." "Sure, John, no problem," Darrow said, not having any idea how he would gain entrance to a closed meeting to which John Goodfriend hadn't been invited. Goodfriend handed him a slip of paper with the room number of Kravis's suite. Darrow strode across 58th Street and took an elevator to the hotel's 5th floor. He checked twice for the room number Goodfriend had written down. It didn't exist. Darrow found himself wandering aimlessly until he saw a very large man standing outside a pair of double doors. "This is Henry's suite?" Darrow said on a hunch. "Yes, sir," the man said, opening the doors. "Go right in." Darrow walked in to find Tom Strauss in the middle of a heated discussion with Kravis and Roberts. He didn't know it at the moment, but he was witnessing the first cracks in Ross Johnson's carefully won $20 billion peace pact. "This is our capital," Strauss was saying. "We're not prepared to put in these amounts when anybody other than us controls the exit." Strauss's speech was impassioned, his plea direct. "Solomon and Shearson simply must run these bond offerings," he said. Solomon was ready to run them, was willing to run them, had the expertise to run them, and demanded the right to run them. They had worked weeks in preparation, and to hand their assignment to Drexel wouldn't be fair. "We've just got to do this thing," Strauss said. "Why don't you try us?" Irked, Kravis explained the importance he placed on Drexel's handling the bonds. "Look," he said, "Drexel has done a first-rate job for us every time. They did Beatrice when everyone said it couldn't be done. They're the best. They're cheap. This is the biggest deal ever. We can't afford to take any chances." Strauss may have been arguing for the sanctity of Solomon's capital, but everyone in the room knew what he was really objecting to. Solomon hated Drexel. To lose history's largest bond offering to its arch-rival would be a profound embarrassment to the firm. For 5 years, Solomon, strong in every other kind of bond, had tried in vain to break into the highly specialized and highly profitable field of junk bonds. But its efforts, plagued by internal politics, had resulted in a series of disasters. Drexel's hammerlock on the market was a source of continuing frustration to Goodfriend. "Not to knock you, but you guys don't really do this stuff," Kravis told Strauss. "You guys haven't done anything here." At one point, Strauss mentioned that Solomon had had 60 bond salesmen in over the weekend to hash out the best ways to sell these bonds. "What am I supposed to tell them?" he asked. Kravis and Roberts rolled their eyes. "So what if your guys were there all weekend?" Kravis said. "That doesn't mean anything. We ought to go with the best, most qualified people." Peter Cohen found himself in an awkward position. Having more or less approved Drexel's selection earlier, he now weighed in with what seemed a half-hearted endorsement of Strauss's stance. Cohen, in fact, had his own reason to distrust Drexel. For 5 years, Shearson had been locked in litigation with Drexel over tin contracts that Cohen believed Drexel had reneged on. Drexel's refusal to make good on the contracts had forced Cohen to take a $50 million charge against his 1985 earnings. Drexel, he said, simply wasn't the kind of firm Shearson felt comfortable betting its future on. Soon, both Kravis and Strauss were repeating themselves. As their debate wound down, No one was overly worried about Sullivan's newfound intransigence. In a deal this large, there were bound to be some sticking points in the fine print. Surely they could reach a compromise later on. Besides, there was a more important matter to be dealt with: the management agreement. Goldstone hauled out a copy and waved it in front of Kravis. "We'd like you to sign off on this," the lawyer said. "Show it to Dick," Kravis said. Beatty watched as Goldstone flipped through the pages and stabbed his thumb at the paragraph he was looking for. "This," he said. "I want to make sure you see this and understand it." It was the control paragraph, stating that Johnson would have full control over the deal. Standing beside Goldstone, Beatty thought it an insignificant detail. If they struck a deal, he knew Kravis was going to call the shots. It was as simple as that. Without saying anything, Beatty took a copy of the agreement and retreated to a corner with Casey Kogut to scan it. Goldstone was nervous. "I want your word that you won't use this document for any reason other than evaluating this transaction," he said, "and that you won't disclose it to anyone." After a few minutes, Beatty motioned to Kravis and Roberts, and, with Kogut, the four retreated into an adjacent bedroom. "You're not going to believe this," Beatty said. The lawyer had read the document quickly, but what he saw was incredible. The control, a veto in Johnson's hands, and, most alarming of all, the astronomical returns Shearson was promising Johnson. "You can't live with this thing, Henry," Beatty said. Kogut agreed. "If we sign up to this deal, Ross will run the whole thing. You're not going to agree with that." Kravis was shocked. He knew Cohen was hungry to get into merchant banking, but giving Johnson control of the deal? It was unlike any LBO he had ever seen. "This is just crazy," Kravis said. "How could Cohen do this?" Kogut and the Solomon lawyer, Peter Darrow, were neighbors on a one-block street in Brooklyn Heights. They had joked that the RJR Nabisco drama would be a good deal for the street, meaning Garton Place, not Wall Street. Kogut emerged from the bedroom and, as the meeting showed signs of breaking up, motioned to Darrow. The Solomon lawyer slipped into the bedroom where Kravis and the others were caucusing. "Have you seen this?" Beatty asked Darrow. Darrow nodded. "Are you on board with this thing?" The Solomon lawyer had expected this. As soon as Goldstone brought out the agreement, he had called Goodfriend to ask how to handle it. Darrow had to walk a fine line. If Solomon were to be partners with Kravis, it was important to signal its discomfort with what Goodfriend called the unseemly agreement. But if the talks somehow fell through, Kravis would no doubt use Solomon's displeasure as a club to publicly maul the management group. Darrow conceded to Beatty that the document had obvious problems and would likely be rewritten. He mentioned that Goodfriend and Warren Buffett opposed it. It was all he had to say. A few minutes later, Beatty stepped back into the living room and took Goldstone aside. "How many people did you say are involved in this?" "Only 7 at the moment," Goldstone said, but Johnson had in mind that hundreds of employees would also share in the riches. "Well, this is pretty rich, you know. You should talk to Ross about that." "Well," Beatty said, "we're obviously going to reserve opinion on this. We can't say yay or nay until we have some time to look at this thing." Goldstone nodded, but suggested they consider the document closely. "You'll need to get things resolved because it's very important." The meeting adjourned with plans to reconvene at RJR Nabisco's offices an hour later. In the confusion, neither Goldstone nor Jack Nussbaum retrieved the management agreement from Beatty. "They never asked for it," said Casey Kogut, "so we kept it." When Kravis, Roberts, Beatty, and Kogut stepped from the elevator onto the 48th floor, they were surprised to find the place packed with people. Scores of people with nothing to do with the negotiations were rushing to and fro. Linda Robinson was scurrying about with a draft copy of a press release. Kravis was nonplussed to be introduced to Laurie Johnson. He spied Johnson, scotch in hand, looking relaxed and refreshed, a puff handkerchief peeking jauntily from a chest pocket. Kravis was also introduced to Ed Horrigan, who looked natty in a white tennis sweater. Expecting to resume a set of tough negotiations, the Kravis group was startled to encounter something more akin to a fraternity mixer. Kravis and Roberts were escorted into Johnson's office, the site of their first tangle a week earlier. In fine spirits, Johnson offered the cousins a drink, which they declined. Beatty slipped Johnson's secretary a draft agreement he had hastily scribbled out and asked that it be typed. There was no sign of Cohen or Strauss. As Kravis and Roberts waited, they listened to Johnson ramble on about the businesses they were all about to co-own. In a wide-ranging soliloquy, Johnson, upbeat, casual, laughing, skittered through a number of subjects, including Premier, the Atlanta headquarters, and the outlook for Nabisco businesses they would sell. He was glad for the time to get to know his new partners. Jim Robinson and Ed Horrigan sat by, listening and chatting occasionally. For nearly an hour, they discussed the fine points of RJR Nabisco. At one point, Gar Basin, the terrier-like Davis Polk lawyer, poked his head into the room. "What are you doing in this room without another lawyer?" Basin challenged Beatty. He was merely being protective of his client, but it broke the mood. Kravis noticed they had been waiting a long time. "What's holding everything up?" "I don't know," Johnson said. But then he wasn't especially concerned. These finishing up sessions always took time. Cohen came in shortly after. He had been working with Strauss and Goodfriend on a way around the bond offering problem. "Where do we stand?" Roberts asked. "We're still trying to thrash this thing out," Cohen explained. In fact, Cohen was getting nowhere. For an hour he had tried to fathom Solomon's objections to Drexel and searched in vain for a compromise. Cohen hadn't come from a trading culture like Solomon's, and sometimes didn't grasp the fine points of Goodfriend's arguments. It was taking time, and he was tired. Later, everyone who participated in the long night's deliberations would emerge with different versions of what came to be known as the Drexel problem. Jim Robinson would point to Drexel's expected indictment. Solomon's official line was its concern about placing its capital in another firm's hands, a curious explanation because it planned to do exactly that with Shearson. Johnson would suggest, mysteriously, that Kravis had somehow come under the control of Drexel. Months later, Tom Strauss acknowledged the central controversy. It lay in the esoteric world of the bond trader. When more than one bank agrees to underwrite a bond offering, a lead bank must be chosen to run the books. The key records of bond sales reside physically at that bank, which generally calls the shots and parcels out bonds over the course of the offering. The lead bank is so noted by placing its name first, on the left side, of the subsequent tombstone advertisements that pack the Wall Street Journal and other financial publications. Being on the left of the tombstone thus has powerful symbolic significance in the bond world. Before Kravis's entry, Strauss and Cohen had agreed that Solomon and Shearson would co-run the books. Shearson would be on the left, Solomon on the right. The books would rest physically at Shearson. That arrangement didn't bother Solomon, Strauss explained, because Solomon's power in the bond world so overshadowed Shearson's that everyone would know who had really run the deal. The same structure, however, would send an entirely different message with Drexel on the left. While Solomon could tower over Shearson from a position on the right, the same wouldn't be true of a bond trading power such as Drexel. With Drexel on the left, Strauss said, we would have been perceived as an afterthought. In the end, then, perception was the issue. Perception about who was running a set of bond offerings that, to Johnson or any other acquirer, was a detail. For despite its status as a full partner in Johnson's deal, despite all the high talk about merchant banking, Solomon's principal mission wasn't owning Oreos. It was selling bonds. And it was willing to sacrifice Johnson's interests, indeed his entire deal, to avoid the perception that it was taking a back seat to its hated rival, Drexel. Through all the machismo, through all the greed, through all the discussion of shareholder values, it all came down to this. John Goodfriend and Tom Strauss were prepared to scrap the largest takeover of all time Because their firm's name would go on the right side, not the left side, of a tombstone advertisement buried among the stock tables at the back of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. By 2 o'clock, Cohen was shuttling between Kravis and Roberts in Johnson's office and a Solomon contingent, which remained in the fishbowl conference room around the corner. Desperately, he sought a middle ground. Whatever doubts Cohen might have had about sharing his bounty with Kravis, that night he tried his best to reconcile the two sides. But no compromise seemed acceptable to Goodfriend. "In no way will we defer to Drexel," Solomon's chairman intoned. "Glad to have him as a partner, Peter, but we haven't gone this far to give this deal up to Drexel." Time after time, Cohen attempted to pull his friend Strauss off to the side for a heart-to-heart talk. Each time, Mike Zimmerman or one of the other Solomon bankers would trot out and join the conversation. Cohen began to think of the Solomon executives as sausages, linked together wherever they went. It was impossible to get a moment alone with any one of them. Only once did Cohen lose his temper. Zimmerman made another of his group's pronouncements about Solomon's reputation. "We are Solomon brothers," he said. "Who do they think they are to treat us this way?" It was too much for Cohen, who proceeded to jump down the banker's throat. "What are you talking about? You guys didn't exactly blow out the lights on Southland and Revco, you know. They have reason to be concerned. I mean, do you even understand what we're doing here?" Cohen tried every alternative he could imagine. Reimbursing Kravis for the extra cost of hiring Solomon, setting up a trading room at a neutral site where all three firms could manage the offering together. He held his breath whenever he saw movement in the Solomon position. Each time they seemed to be nearing an agreement, a Solomon banker popped off about Drexel. "What are we doing?" one would say. "These guys are crooks. They're crooks." And the whole group would set off on a spree of Drexel bashing. It was as frustrating as anything Cohen had attempted. A man who prided himself on his stamina, Shearson's chief had to admit he was exhausted. For 2 weeks, he had been fighting nonstop. He needed sleep. Negotiating the most important issues of history's largest takeover at 2 a.m? It made no sense. Why were they here? As the night wore on, Johnson, who continued to be impressed with Kravis's financial sophistication, began to lean perceptively toward his position. "Why not go with Drexel?" Johnson asked, "if in fact they were most reliable." "Peter, we should have the best people doing this. I don't care who they are," Johnson said. "If it's a better idea, let's use the better idea." Johnson's behavior emboldened Kravis. "Why don't you go out there and bang out a compromise yourself?" Kravis asked Johnson at one point. After all, wasn't Johnson the client here? Couldn't he simply demand that his own investment bankers go along with his wishes? Johnson said he'd give it a try. He left, then returned 20 minutes later. "Well, I talked to him." "And?" Kravis wondered. "Well, I still don't know what's going on." "Who the hell is making decisions around here?" Kravis said, his anger growing. "Well, I don't know," Johnson replied. "There's all these guys from Solomon out there." Jim Robinson, who had kept his counsel through most of the evening, thought he saw a solution. Goodfriend, he suggested, hadn't liked being excluded from their discussions at the plaza. "I think his feelings are hurt," Robinson said. "Why don't you guys sit down and talk with him?" "Fine," Kravis said. "Why don't you go get him?" Word came back that no one could find Goodfriend. He had vanished. "Where the hell is he?" Johnson asked, stalking out of the room. He checked first with the security guards, who said they thought Goodfriend had gone out for a walk. If Goodfriend was pouting, Johnson figured, it would probably only make things worse to send a minion after him, so Johnson went to retrieve him himself. He found him on 57th Street, smoking a cigar. Goodfriend appeared to be lost in thought. "Come on, John, you got to get upstairs and spend some time with Henry," Johnson said. "This thing seems to be moving along." Around 3 o'clock, Kravis and Roberts sat down with Goodfriend in the small anteroom off Johnson's office. "We're trying to be reasonable here," Kravis said. "Now, why is it so important that you guys run this deal?" "Because I think we're competent," Goodfriend said. "Because our people have spent a considerable amount of time on this. We are perfectly capable of doing this job, and we should do it. There are any number of reasons we should do this deal. Our firm has taken a terrible beating in recent years. Kravis knew it was one reason they didn't want Solomon running the books. Now, I've got the most respect for Mike Milken, Goodfriend continued, but this is how we at Solomon Brothers want to proceed. Goodfriend, it was clear, wasn't budging, but neither was Kravis. When Goodfriend left the room, Roberts sank into a dark mood. He stood talking with Kravis beside Johnson's wet bar for several minutes until Dick Beatty walked in. "Look, this is crazy," Roberts said. "We've spent all night arguing who's going to be on the left and right of the underwriting tombstone. How are we going to work out agreement on the real issues? How are we going to work with these guys even if we do this deal? Everyone's interested in everything except doing a business deal. It's all jockeying for ego and position." He was growing more depressed just talking about it. "I came in here thinking we were going to do a deal," Roberts said. "Now—" "I believe you, George," Kravis said, nodding his head in agreement. "You're absolutely right." Beatty shared his client's discouragement. "You know, there's a lot of issues in the management agreement we put off, too. If we can't get this behind us, we'll never get anything behind us." "Let's just go home and get some sleep," Roberts said. "This is crazy." Kravis took Cohen aside and told him they should resume after daylight. As for the bond situation, Roberts and Kravis planned to talk through compromises at a 7 o'clock breakfast with Drexel's Peter Ackerman, the trader stepping into Milken's shoes. Maybe Ackerman could come up with something Goodfriend could live with. "Call me at home when you're ready to reconvene," Cohen said. As the Kravis contingent headed for the elevator, Goodfriend came scurrying after them. Dick, hold it a second. Let's talk this over." Beatty tried to calm the Solomon chairman. "We're just not making any progress, John." Kravis and Roberts paused while Beatty walked back to speak with the Solomon bankers milling about in the fishbowl. A dozen questions pelted the lawyer as he entered. "Why are you guys so protective of Drexel?" someone asked. "They're big boys. They can take care of themselves." "Look," Beatty said, "all night Peter Cohen has been defending you guys. The Drexel guys are our partners. They've been good to us. We're not going to desert them." Beatty didn't belabor the fact that Solomon had repeatedly bungled its attempts to enter the LBO field, or that Kravis would sooner have his mother handle this offering than Solomon, or that Kravis felt Strauss had betrayed him. It was all so complicated. By the time Kravis and Roberts departed, Johnson had already left. Garbason had a memorandum of agreement between the two sides ready to sign, and Johnson initialed it on his way out. The impasse between Kravis and Solomon, he was certain, would be solved by daylight. Frankly, he liked Kravis's approach better than Shearson's, but he would be satisfied with whatever approach they chose. These last-minute details were just so tiresome. Many of the Shearson group stayed and stewed over the night's events until 5 a.m. Two members of the Solomon contingent, Peter Darrow and Mike Zimmerman, emerged into the dawn to find their cab had been waiting for 8 hours. The meter was still running. "Excuse me, sirs," the driver said as he dropped the pair off in Brooklyn Heights. "Would you mind initialing this voucher? No one's going to believe this." Dawn was gathering when Cohen dragged himself into his Fifth Avenue apartment. He thought about going to bed, but knew he was too wound up to fall asleep immediately. In the bedroom, his wife, Karen, woke up and asked how it went. Rarely had Cohen felt so frustrated. For the first time in his career, he hadn't been able to build a bridge between warring factions. It was an ability he prided himself on. They sat on the bed, husband and wife, for nearly an hour, sorting out the night's events, slowly unwinding, before quietly falling asleep. The ringing phone beside his bed jarred Cohen from a deep sleep. Through bleary eyes, he stared at the clock. It was 8 o'clock. Tucking the receiver to his ear, Cohen heard the cool voice of Henry Kravis. They were ready to meet. Cohen wasn't looking forward to seeing Kravis again. For some reason, he couldn't seem to shake his head clear. He called Jim Robinson. "Whatever you're doing," Cohen said, "drop it. Come on up and meet me at 9 West. Next, Cohen called Jeff Lane. Shearson's number 2 executive hadn't been deeply involved in the RJR drama so far, for he had his hands full running the company in Cohen's absence. Now, Cohen needed him. "I'm really worn out here," he told Lane. "I may not be thinking as clearly as I should. I need someone with a fresh head." By 9 o'clock, a small group had reassembled in Johnson's offices. Only Goodfriend and Strauss made up the Solomon contingent. Kravis and Roberts showed up a few minutes later, ready to talk. Cohen suggested they return downstairs to their own offices until Johnson turned up. When Johnson hadn't arrived 15 minutes later, someone called his apartment and discovered he was still asleep. Around 9:15, Cohen went down to Kravis's offices, so tired he could barely see straight, and found Kravis and Roberts with Dick Beatty. At breakfast, Peter Ackerman had offered to back out of the deal if Kravis wished. Kravis wanted no such thing. Asked for a compromise, Ackerman came up with something he thought Goodfriend could live with. The bond offerings would be split. Drexel would head the first portion, with Shearson on the right, and Solomon would head the second, also with Shearson on the right. Similar ideas had been batted around the night before, but Kravis thought it sounded reasonable. Cohen tried his best to listen, not sure he fully understood the proposal. Less than a half hour later, he returned upstairs to explain Kravis's compromise to a group that now included Jack Nussbaum, Jim Robinson, and Steve Goldstone. Johnson still hadn't shown up. When Goodfriend and the others began questioning him about Ackerman's plan, Cohen found himself short of answers. "Look, I give up," Cohen wearily told the group. "Maybe somebody else can crack the code here. Maybe somebody else should go down and see what you can do." Jeff Lane and Jack Nussbaum were chosen to make the second sortie. Downstairs, Kravis sent the pair into another room and had Ted Emmon explain again the compromise he had in mind. Kravis was alarmed. Lane and Nussbaum didn't seem to have the slightest grasp of what they were talking about. In her apartment above the Museum of Modern Art, Linda Robinson was awakened by a call from her secretary.